My dad abandoned me for his new family and only showed up when I got stage 3 cancer to ease his guilt. He was crying when I disowned him publicly. When I was 6, my dad left me and mom for his secretary, Tanya. Just packed up one day and moved across town like we were an old apartment he'd outgrown. The custody agreement said every other weekend, but that lasted maybe 2 months before Tanya got pregnant, and suddenly Dad was too busy with his real family to pick me up. I'd sit by the window with my overnight bag until Mom would quietly put it away and make us hot chocolate instead. By the time I was 8, I only saw him at my grandparents' house during holidays. He'd show up with Tanya and their twins, matching outfits and professional photos on his phone of their trips to Disney and the beach. He'd ruffle my hair and ask about school like we were distant relatives, then spend the rest of the visit playing with the twins while I watched from the couch. Grandma would try to include me, but Dad would say I was too old for baby games. When I turned 13, I stopped going to family events if he'd be there. Mom never pushed it. She'd remarried by then to Paul, who actually showed up to my soccer games and helped with homework. Paul never tried to be my dad, but he was there, which was more than my actual father managed. I graduated high school without Dad in the audience, got into college without his help, started my career without his advice, built a whole life where his absence was just background noise I'd learned to ignore. Then at 28, I collapsed at work. The diagnosis came fast and brutal. Stage 3 lymphoma, aggressive type, needed immediate treatment. The doctors were optimistic but honest about what I was facing. Months of chemo, radiation, the whole nightmare. Mom was at the hospital within an hour. Paul canceled a business trip. My friends set up a meal rotation. Everyone circled around me except the one person who'd been circling away my whole life. Until Grandma told him. Then suddenly Dad discovered he had a daughter. He showed up at the hospital with flowers and tears, talking about how he'd been waiting for the right time to reconnect, and this was a sign we needed each other. 22 years of absence, and now he wanted to play father because I might die. He started coming to every appointment, sat through every chemo session reading me stories like I was 5 again. He actually told Tanya he was spending nights at the hospital instead of home. She called me selfish for taking him from their children, his real children. But Dad kept coming. He'd hold my hand while I puked, shave his head when I lost my hair, bring me soup from this place we used to go when I was little. He cried about all the time we'd lost, how much he regretted choosing Tanya's ultimatum over me, how he'd spent years thinking I was better off without him messing up my life. He said the diagnosis woke him up to what really mattered. Every day he'd tell me he loved me and he was so sorry for everything. For 3 months, I let him play devoted father. Let him ease his guilt while poison dripped into my veins. I was too tired to fight, and some pathetic part of me that still remembered being 6 wanted to believe him. The treatment worked. The scans came back clear. The doctors said I'd beaten it for now, would need monitoring, but could start rebuilding my life. Dad was there when they delivered the news, sobbing with relief, promising we'd make up for lost time now that I was getting better. That night, I was home in my apartment, finally feeling human again, when Dad texted. Said he was so happy I was better, and he'd check in next week, but Tanya needed him to focus on the twins' school situation. A week became a month. The text stopped. He missed my follow-up appointments. When I called, Tanya answered and said he was busy with his actual responsibilities now that the crisis was over. 6 months later, at Grandma's birthday, Dad showed up with his perfect family again. He tried to hug me like nothing had happened. Started to say how good I looked, how proud he was of my strength, how our experience had brought us closer. That's when I lost it. In front of everyone, I told him exactly what kind of father he was. A coward who needed me to be dying to pretend he cared. A man so weak he let his second wife erase his first child until cancer made him look bad. I told him those 3 months of him playing daddy meant nothing because I knew he'd disappear the second I wasn't dying anymore. And I was right. The twins were staring at me. Tanya was calling me ungrateful. Dad was crying, saying I didn't understand the position he'd been in, how Tanya had made him choose. I laughed. Actually laughed. I told him he'd been making that choice for 22 years, every single time he picked Tanya's comfort over my existence. My voice got louder with each word, and I didn't care who heard anymore. I said the only difference between then and now was that everyone finally got to see what kind of man he really was, instead of the devoted father act he performed for Tanya's approval. Dad's face crumpled and he reached for me, but I stepped back. I told him not to touch me, that he'd lost that right when I was 6 years old sitting by the window with my overnight bag. Tanya started yelling that I was a spoiled brat who couldn't accept that he had other responsibilities, that I'd always been jealous of her children, that showing up during my cancer proved he cared. I laughed again because the absurdity of her words made something break loose in my chest. I told her that showing up when someone might die isn't love, it's guilt management and disappearing. The second the crisis ends proves exactly what it was. The twins just stood there frozen, and I could see something shifting in their faces as they processed everything. Grandma tried to say my name, but I was already walking toward the door. Mom appeared at my side instantly with Paul right behind her, and we left while Dad was still crying and Tanya was still shouting about disrespect. We sat in Mom's car in Grandma's driveway for 20 minutes while my whole body shook. Paul was driving and Mom held my hand in the back seat without saying anything. My hands wouldn't stop trembling and my breath kept catching like I'd been running. Everything I'd held inside for 22 years had just exploded in front of everyone, and I felt raw and exposed and weirdly lighter at the same time. Mom squeezed my fingers and asked if I was okay, and I said I didn't know, but I wasn't sorry. Paul caught my eyes in the rearview mirror and nodded once, firm and sure. We drove to their house because I couldn't face my empty apartment yet. The adrenaline made everything feel sharp and too bright. I kept replaying the look on Dad's face when I called him a coward, the way the twins stared at me like they were seeing something that didn't match the story they'd been told their whole lives. Mom made tea when we got inside, and I sat at their kitchen table while my phone started buzzing in my purse. I pulled it out and the screen was already filling with texts. My cousin sent 3 messages saying she was proud of me for finally speaking up. An aunt I barely knew called me cruel and heartless. Another cousin said Dad was still at Grandma's crying and everyone was uncomfortable. Uncle Roderick texted that it was about time someone told the truth. Tanya's sister sent a long message about how I'd ruined a nice family event with my bitterness and jealousy. My phone kept buzzing and buzzing until I turned it face down on the table. Mom sat across from me and said I didn't have to look at any of it right now. Paul took my phone without asking and disappeared into his office. I heard him typing and knew he was reading everything, deciding what I needed to see and what could wait. More texts came through on Mom's phone, and she glanced at them before setting hers face down too. She told me people were taking sides like they always do in family drama, but that didn't change the fact that everything I said was true. I asked if she thought I was cruel for saying it in front of everyone, and she said no. I was honest, and sometimes honesty feels cruel to people who've been avoiding it for years. I stayed at Mom and Paul's house for 2 days because the thought of being alone in my apartment made my chest tight. Mom cooked all my favorite foods from when I was little, like that would somehow fix what was broken, but I ate it anyway because it felt good to be taken care of. She made the mac and cheese with the breadcrumb topping I used to request for every birthday. She baked the chocolate chip cookies with extra chips that she'd pack in my lunchbox. She even made the weird casserole with the crushed potato chips on top that no one else in the family liked, but I loved. Paul handled my phone the entire time, reading messages and only showing me the supportive ones. He'd come out of his office every few hours and give me updates in his calm way. He said my boss texted asking if I was okay, and telling me to take whatever time I needed. He said 3 friends were organizing to bring me dinner when I was ready. He said half the family was on my side and the other half would get over it eventually. He didn't tell me what the other messages said, but I could see the tight line of his jaw when he read them. On the second night, I heard him on the phone in his office speaking in his quiet, firm voice, and I knew he was responding to someone who'd sent something particularly bad. Mom came and sat on the edge of the guest bed where I was supposed to be sleeping, but mostly just staring at the ceiling. She said Paul was protective of me and always had been, even back when I was 13 and angry at the world. She told me he'd taken this whole situation with Dad harder than she expected, because he genuinely couldn't understand how a father walks away from his kid. I asked if she was mad that I'd caused all this family drama, and she laughed. Actually laughed. She said the drama had been there for 22 years. I'd just finally said it out loud where everyone had to hear it. On the 3rd day, Grandma called my phone directly, and Paul brought it to me with a questioning look. I nodded, and he handed it over before leaving the room to give me privacy. Grandma's voice sounded tired in a way I'd never heard before, worn down and sad. She said she needed to talk to me about what happened at her party. My stomach clenched because I thought she was going to tell me I'd ruined everything and embarrassed the family. But instead, she said she'd known for years that her son had failed me, watched it happen and stayed quiet because she didn't know how to fix it. She told me that watching him cry at her party broke her heart, but she understood why I'd said what I did. She said sometimes the truth comes out messy and loud because it's been buried too long. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just listened while she talked. She told me Dad had called her late that night after everyone left, sobbing so hard she could barely understand him. He'd said things she'd never heard him admit before, about how he knew his guilt during my cancer wasn't really love, it was just him trying to feel better about himself. She said he finally understood that showing up for 3 months didn't erase 22 years of absence. Grandma's voice got quieter, and she said she wished she'd pushed him harder years ago to be the father I deserved. I told her it wasn't her job to fix her grown son's failures. She said maybe not, but she was still his mother, and she felt like she'd failed us both by not speaking up sooner. I agreed to meet Grandma for coffee 4 days after the party, because she asked directly, and she'd never taken sides before. She'd always tried to include me at family events, even when Dad made it clear I wasn't really part of his new family. I owed her the conversation even though I didn't really want to have it. We met at this little coffee shop halfway between Mom's house and hers. She looked older than I remembered, more fragile somehow. We sat in a corner booth and she ordered us both coffee and these almond pastries she knew I liked when I was little. She started talking before I could figure out what to say. She told me that Dad had called her again the night after our first conversation, still crying but more coherent this time. He'd told her things about his guilt and his selfishness that she'd suspected but never heard him admit. She said he finally understood that his presence during my cancer was about easing his own conscience, not actually supporting me. He'd realized that the second I didn't need him anymore, he'd disappeared back to his comfortable life with Tanya and the twins. Grandma said he told her that was the pattern of his entire relationship with me since the divorce, showing up when it made him look good or feel better, but vanishing when actual consistent effort was required. She reached across the table and took my hand. She said she wasn't asking me to forgive him or have a relationship with him, just wanted me to know that something had shifted in him after what I said at the party. I pulled my hand back and told her that people don't really change. They just feel bad until enough time passes, and then they go back to who they always were. Grandma got quiet for a minute, and then she told me something I'd never known before. She said Dad's own father had abandoned their family when Dad was 12 years old. Just left one day for another woman and never came back. She said Dad had been destroyed by it, spent his teenage years angry and hurt, and swearing he'd never do that to his own children. She told me he'd promised himself he'd be different, be better, be the father his dad never was. I felt something cold settle in my stomach because I knew where this was going. She said that's what made his failure with me so much worse for him, that he'd become exactly what he'd sworn he'd never be. She was quick to add that this didn't excuse what he'd done to me, didn't make it okay or forgivable, but it explained why he was so broken by his own actions. I sat there staring at my coffee and processing this information I'd never had before. Part of me wanted to feel sympathy for him, understanding for the cycle of abandonment he'd fallen into. But a bigger part of me was just angry that he'd known exactly how it felt to be left behind, and he'd done it to me anyway. I told Grandma that knowing his father abandoned him just made it worse, not better. He knew the damage it caused, and he chose to inflict it on me. She nodded slowly and said she'd thought I might feel that way. She said she just wanted me to have the whole picture, even if it didn't change anything. I went back to my apartment and my job the next week because I couldn't hide at Mom's house forever. My coworkers were weird around me in that careful way people get when they know something bad happened but don't know the details. A few of them followed me on social media and had clearly seen something or heard through mutual connections. They treated me with this gentle kindness that made me want to scream because I didn't want to be handled like I might break. My boss called me into her office on my second day back and I thought I was in trouble for the drama. But she just told me to take whatever time I needed if family stuff got too much. She said her door was always open and I could leave early or work from home anytime without needing to explain. I thanked her and got out of there before I started crying, because her unexpected kindness hit me harder than I expected. At my desk, I tried to focus on work, but kept checking my phone out of habit. The texts had mostly stopped, but social media was a different story. The twins' accounts kept showing up in my feed because we were technically connected even though we'd never had a real relationship. One of them posted something vague about learning your heroes aren't who you thought they were. No names, no details, just that cryptic sentence with a sad face emoji. I stared at it for a long time, feeling this complicated twist in my chest. Part of me felt guilty for destroying their image of Dad, for being the one who showed them their father wasn't the man they thought he was. But another part of me felt vindicated that they finally knew the truth, that they were seeing what I'd lived with for 22 years. A week after the party, Tanya sent me an email. I saw her name in my inbox and almost deleted it without reading, but something made me open it. The email started defensive just like I expected. She wrote about how I'd embarrassed Dad publicly, hurt the twins who didn't deserve to witness that, ruined what should have been a nice family celebration. She said I was bitter and jealous and couldn't accept that Dad had moved on with his life. But then the tone shifted about halfway through and became something rawer and more honest. She admitted she'd given Dad an ultimatum years ago when she got pregnant with the twins. She'd been 23 and scared, and she'd told him he had to choose between his old family and his new one. She wrote that she'd been terrified of being a single mother, terrified he'd leave her like he'd left my mom, so she'd made him prove his commitment by cutting off his past completely. She said she'd spent 20 years justifying that decision by telling herself I was better off with just my mom, that Dad's presence would have confused me or made things harder. She wrote that hearing me at Grandma's party had destroyed that comfortable story she'd been telling herself. She said she finally understood that her fear and insecurity had cost me a father while giving her children the parent I deserved. The email ended with her saying she wasn't asking for forgiveness or trying to make excuses, just wanted me to know she was sorry for what she'd demanded all those years ago. I didn't respond to Tanya's email for a week because I genuinely didn't know what to say to the woman who demanded my father erase me from his life. I read it probably 20 times, each time finding new layers in her words. Part of me wanted to write back something angry and cutting, to make her feel as small as I'd felt all those years. But mostly I just felt tired of being angry all the time. Mom asked if I'd heard from Tanya and I showed her the email. She read it twice and then handed my phone back without comment. I asked what she thought and she said that understanding why someone hurt you doesn't mean you have to forgive them for it. She said Tanya was right to own her part in what happened, but that didn't undo 22 years of damage. When I finally wrote back, I kept it short. I told Tanya I understood fear and insecurity because I'd felt both of those things my entire childhood, wondering why my father didn't want me. I said understanding her reasons didn't make what happened to me acceptable or forgivable. I wrote that she'd been a scared young woman who made a terrible choice, and then spent 2 decades defending it instead of examining it, and those were years of my life I couldn't get back. I told her I appreciated her honesty, but I wasn't ready to absolve her of responsibility for demanding a father abandon his child. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, and then turned off my phone for the rest of the day. 2 weeks after Grandma's birthday party, I sat in the oncology clinic waiting room for my follow-up appointment. The familiar smell of antiseptic and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights brought back memories of all those months when Dad had sat beside me in chairs just like these. Now the chair next to me stayed empty. Mom had offered to come, but I told her I could handle a routine scan alone. The nurse called my name and I followed her back to the exam room, changed into the gown, lay still in the CT scanner while it whirred and clicked around me. The whole process felt different without Dad's hand to hold, or his nervous chatter to distract me. What surprised me most was the relief. I didn't want him here. Didn't miss his presence or wish he'd show up at the last minute with coffee and apologies. The technician helped me off the table and told me the doctor would have results in about an hour. I sat in the waiting room scrolling through my phone, and when the oncologist finally called me into her office, she smiled before she even spoke. The scans were clear, still in remission. My blood work looked good. She scheduled my next appointment for 3 months out instead of 6 weeks, said I was doing great. I thanked her and walked out to my car, sat behind the wheel for a few minutes just breathing. Dad wasn't here for the good news, and I was genuinely okay with that. Better than okay. The absence of his crisis-driven attention felt cleaner than his presence ever had. Mom texted asking how it went, and I told her the scans were clear. She responded immediately saying she was taking me to lunch to celebrate. No arguments allowed. We met at this Italian place near her house, the kind with red checkered tablecloths and breadsticks that come out hot before you even order. Mom hugged me hard in the parking lot before we went inside, and I could feel her relief in the way she held on an extra few seconds. We ordered pasta and salads, and Mom asked me how I was really doing, not just with the cancer, but with everything that happened at the party. I told her I felt lighter somehow, like finally saying all that stuff out loud had released something I'd been carrying since I was 6. She reached across the table and took my hand, her eyes getting shiny the way they do when she's trying not to cry. Then she told me something she'd never said before. She said when Dad stopped showing up when I was 8, part of her had been relieved. Watching me sit by the window every other Friday with my overnight bag packed, seeing my face fall. When he didn't come, then trying to act like I was fine when she put the bag away, that had broken her heart worse than the divorce ever did. She said his inconsistency hurt me more than his complete absence would have, and she'd been grateful when he finally just stayed away, because at least then I could start healing instead of hoping every 2 weeks that this time would be different. I squeezed her hand and told her I understood now what she meant. The 3 months Dad showed up during my cancer had felt good at first, but the hope had made his second disappearance cut even deeper. She nodded and said that's exactly what she'd been afraid of, that he'd do this to me again, and she hated being right about it. That evening, Paul asked if he could talk to me privately, and we sat on their back porch while Mom cleaned up from dinner. Paul's not usually the serious conversation type, so I knew something was on his mind. He stared at his hands for a minute before he started talking, said he'd been thinking a lot since the party about his role in my life. He told me he'd never tried to be my dad because he saw how much Dad's abandonment had damaged me, saw how I flinched away from father figures and kept people at arm's length. He said he'd made a conscious choice just to be present and reliable, to show up for soccer games and help with homework, and be there for the boring everyday stuff without ever asking me to call him Dad or treat him like a replacement. His hope had been that I'd learn through his actions that real love shows up consistently, not just during emergencies or when it's convenient. He said watching Dad reappear during my cancer and then vanish again had made him furious because it proved everything he'd been trying to teach me about consistent love. I felt tears running down my face and I hugged him, told him he'd been more of a father to me than Dad ever managed, that showing up for all those small moments had mattered more than any dramatic gesture. Paul hugged me back and said being part of my life had been one of his greatest privileges. The next week I called a therapist Mom had recommended, a woman named Evelyn Howell who worked with family stuff and difficult relationships. Evelyn had an opening the following Tuesday, so I took it, showed up at her office in this quiet building downtown. She had plants everywhere and soft lighting, the kind of space designed to make you feel safe enough to fall apart. I sat on her couch and she asked me what brought me in, so I told her the whole story, Dad leaving. When I was 6, 22 years of absence, showing up for my cancer, then disappearing when I went into remission, me finally losing it at Grandma's party. Evelyn listened without interrupting, took notes occasionally, nodded in places that made me feel heard rather than judged. When I finished, she asked me a question that stopped me cold. She asked what I actually wanted from Dad now. Not what I thought I should want, not what would make other people happy, but what I genuinely wanted for myself. I opened my mouth to answer and realized I had no idea. I'd spent so long being angry, so focused on what he'd done wrong and how much he'd hurt me, that I'd never actually considered what reconciliation might look like, or whether I even wanted it. Evelyn said that was okay, that figuring out what I wanted was part of the work we'd do together. She said anger was valid and useful, but eventually I'd need to decide what came after the anger, what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted with Dad going forward. 3 weeks after the party, Grandma called and said Dad had sent something for me, asked if she could drop it off. I told her to just leave it in my mailbox. I didn't need to see her right now. The next day, I found a thick envelope in my mailbox with my name written in Dad's handwriting. I sat in my car and stared at it for 5 minutes before I opened it. Inside was a letter, several pages written on notebook paper. Dad's handwriting was messier than I remembered, like his hands had been shaking while he wrote. The letter started with him saying he'd started seeing a therapist himself, someone who worked with parents who'd failed their kids. He wrote that the therapist was helping him understand that Tanya's ultimatum had worked because he'd already been looking for an excuse to choose the easier path, and facing that truth about himself was destroying him. He said he'd told himself for years that Tanya made him choose, that he'd been trapped between two families, and forced to pick one. But his therapist was making him see that he'd wanted to pick Tanya's family because it was new and uncomplicated, and didn't come with the guilt of divorce. I was a reminder of his failure with Mom, of promises he'd broken, and it had been easier to just start over than to face what he'd done. He wrote that understanding this about himself made him sick, that he'd spent 22 years blaming Tanya for a choice he'd actually wanted to make. The letter kept going, and I had to stop reading twice because my hands were shaking. Dad wrote that he'd been going to therapy for 2 weeks now, and every session peeled back another layer of self-deception he'd built up. He said showing up during my cancer hadn't been about supporting me. It had been about easing his own guilt and fear. He'd been terrified I'd die hating him and he wouldn't be able to live with himself, so he'd played devoted father to make himself feel better. Then when I went into remission, and he didn't have to face his mortality through mine anymore, he'd gone right back to his comfortable life with Tanya and the twins. He wrote that he'd convinced himself I was better off without him, that I had Mom and Paul and didn't need him complicating things, but really he just hadn't wanted to do the hard work of being a consistent parent. The letter included no requests for forgiveness or contact. He didn't ask me to call him or meet with him or give him another chance. He just acknowledged that he'd failed me in every way that mattered, that he'd been a coward and a bad father, and that he was working on becoming someone who might deserve to be in my life if I ever decided to allow it. He ended by saying he didn't expect anything from me, that he knew he'd lost the right to expect anything years ago, but he wanted me to know he was finally facing who he really was, instead of hiding behind excuses. I brought the letter to my next therapy session with Evelyn and read parts of it out loud. My voice kept cracking, and I had to stop several times. When I finished, Evelyn asked me how the letter made me feel. I told her I didn't know. That part of me wanted to believe Dad was genuinely changing, but another part remembered all the times he'd seemed genuine before, and then disappeared anyway. Evelyn nodded and said that was a completely reasonable reaction. She told me that Dad's self-awareness didn't obligate me to anything, that understanding why someone hurt you doesn't mean you have to forgive them or let them back into your life. She said people can genuinely change and work on themselves and become better versions of who they were, and they can still not earn back what they lost. That's a consequence of their choices, not cruelty on my part. She asked me if I wanted to respond to the letter, and I said I didn't know yet. Evelyn said that was fine. I could sit with it as long as I needed to, and we'd work through what I wanted to do about Dad when I was ready. My cousin Lucas called me out of nowhere the next week. We'd been close when we were kids, but drifted apart over the years, mostly because family gatherings got too awkward with Dad there. Lucas asked if I wanted to meet for coffee, and something in his voice told me this wasn't just a casual catch-up. We met at this place downtown, and Lucas hugged me before we even sat down, told me he was proud of me for what I'd said at Grandma's party. I asked him what he meant, and he said he'd watched Dad fail me our entire lives and never said anything, and he was sorry for that silence. He said seeing me finally stand up for myself and call Dad out in front of everyone had made him realize he should have spoken up years ago, should have told Dad he was being a terrible father instead of just avoiding the situation. I told Lucas it wasn't his job to fix Dad's relationship with me, but he shook his head. He said family means speaking up when you see someone being hurt, and he'd chosen peace over truth for too long. Lucas told me something I hadn't known. He said his dad, Roderick, had confronted Dad the night of the party after everyone left. Roderick had apparently seen everything that happened with Dad and me after the divorce, watched Dad choose Tanya's family over me year after year, and had been disgusted by it, but stayed quiet to keep family peace. After my confrontation at the party, Roderick had finally told Dad what he really thought, called him a coward who'd been failing his daughter for 22 years. Lucas said his dad told him later that night that he regretted his silence, that watching me have to defend myself alone at that party when the adults in the family should have been defending me all along had made him ashamed. I felt tears in my eyes hearing this because I'd spent so long thinking nobody else saw what Dad was doing, that maybe I was being too sensitive or holding grudges. Knowing that Roderick had seen it too, that other people recognized Dad's failures even if they hadn't spoken up, made me feel less alone somehow. 4 weeks after the confrontation at Grandma's party, I got a message on social media from someone I didn't immediately recognize. The profile picture showed one of the twins, but I'd never actually connected with either of them online before. I opened the message, and it started with her introducing herself properly for the first time. Her name was Isabella. She said she was sorry for all the years she got the father I deserved, and she'd been trying to understand since the party how Dad could be so present for her while abandoning me completely. She wrote that she'd spent 4 weeks watching Dad differently, noticing things she'd never paid attention to before, and she was starting to see what I meant about him being performative and crisis-driven. She asked if I'd be willing to meet with her sometime, said she wanted to hear my side of the story directly instead of through family gossip or Dad's version of events. I stared at the message for a long time before I responded. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to keep the twins separate from my healing process. But another part of me was curious about Isabella, about what she'd noticed in Dad's behavior, about whether she was genuinely trying to understand or just making herself feel better about benefiting from his abandonment of me. I texted Isabella back and agreed to meet at a coffee shop near her college campus. The place was small and busy with students, which felt safer than somewhere quiet where the conversation might get too heavy. She showed up right on time, wearing jeans and a hoodie that made her look younger than 20. We hugged awkwardly because we'd never actually hugged before, then sat down with our drinks between us like a buffer. She started talking immediately, like she'd been holding these words in for weeks. She told me she'd been watching Dad since the party, really watching him instead of just existing around him. She said she noticed how he checked Tanya's face before he laughed at jokes, how he asked her permission with his eyes before he made plans, how his whole personality shifted depending on whether Tanya approved or disapproved. Isabella said it made her feel sick because she'd always thought Dad was just naturally devoted to their family, but now she could see he was performing devotion to keep Tanya happy. She told me about a night last week when Dad had been playing a board game with her and Camden, and Tanya had walked in and made a comment about him wasting time when he had work emails to answer. Isabella said Dad had immediately put down his game piece and gone to his laptop, and she'd realized he did that every single time Tanya expressed even mild disapproval. She asked me if Dad had been like that before he left, if he'd always needed someone else's approval to know how to act. I told her I didn't remember much from before age 6, but the few memories I had showed a different person. I told her about how Dad used to take me to this little diner on Saturday mornings and let me order chocolate chip pancakes even though Mom said it was too much sugar. I told her about how he'd read me the same bedtime story 5 nights in a row because I loved it, doing different voices for each character without complaining. I told her about the time he'd built me a blanket fort in the living room, and we'd eaten lunch inside it while pretending we were camping. Isabella listened with this look on her face like I was describing a stranger, and I realized that's exactly what I was doing. The Dad I remembered from age 6 had nothing in common with the man who'd spent 20 years prioritizing Tanya's comfort over his daughter's existence. The conversation with Isabella lasted almost 3 hours and left me feeling like I'd run a marathon. Talking about the good parts of Dad, the brief period when he'd actually been present and engaged, reminded me what I'd lost in a way that was different from the usual anger. I'd spent so long being mad about his absence that I'd almost forgotten there had been something worth missing. When I got home, I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. My next therapy session with Evelyn was 2 days later, and I brought up the conversation immediately. I told her about describing those early memories to Isabella, about how it had felt like talking about someone who'd died, rather than someone who'd just chosen to leave. Evelyn leaned forward in her chair and told me something that made my chest tight. She said I was mourning not just the absent father who'd disappeared for 22 years, but the present father who'd existed briefly before he made the choice to abandon me. She explained that people think grief is only for death, but we grieve all kinds of losses, including the loss of who someone used to be before they changed into someone we don't recognize. She said the dad who made me pancakes and built blanket forts had been real, and losing him was a legitimate thing to grieve even though he was still technically alive. I started crying in her office, not the angry tears I'd cried at Grandma's party, but something quieter and sadder. Evelyn handed me tissues and told me this grief was actually progress, that anger had protected me for years, but now I was strong enough to feel the sadness underneath it. She said feeling sad about what I'd lost didn't mean I had to forgive Dad or let him back into my life. I could mourn the father I deserved while still maintaining boundaries with the father I actually had. 5 weeks after the party, I woke up with symptoms that made my blood turn cold. The fatigue was back, that specific kind of exhaustion that sleep didn't touch. My lymph nodes felt swollen when I touched my neck. I had night sweats that soaked through my sheets. Every single symptom screamed cancer recurrence, and the fear that crashed through me was worse than anything I'd felt during the original diagnosis. At least then I hadn't known what was coming. Now I knew exactly what chemo felt like, what radiation did to my body, how many months of hell I'd face if the cancer had returned. I called my oncologist's office the second they opened and tried to keep my voice steady while I described my symptoms. The nurse told me to come in immediately for blood work and an exam. I drove to the hospital with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, and when the doctor examined me and ordered emergency scans, she saw the terror on my face and squeezed my hand. She told me not to panic yet, that these symptoms could mean lots of things, but I could see in her eyes that she was worried too. The scans were scheduled for 3 days out because of equipment availability, which meant 3 days of waiting and wondering if the cancer had come back to finish what it started. I called Mom from the parking lot and barely got the words out before I started sobbing. She told me she and Paul were coming over immediately, and they weren't leaving until we had answers. Mom and Paul showed up at my apartment an hour later with groceries and overnight bags. They set up camp in my living room like they were preparing for a siege, and their presence reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten during all the drama with Dad. I'd built a real family without him. Mom made soup even though I wasn't hungry, and Paul put on old movies we'd watched together when I was in high school. They didn't try to tell me everything would be fine or offer false reassurance. They just stayed. That first night, I woke up at 3 a.m. in a panic and found Mom asleep on my couch with her phone in her hand, like she'd fallen asleep waiting to hear from me. The next 2 days crawled by in a blur of anxiety and forced normalcy. Paul took time off work without being asked. Mom canceled her book club and a dentist appointment. They were just there, steady and reliable, doing crossword puzzles and making sandwiches and existing in my space so I wouldn't have to be alone with my fear. On the 3rd day, we went back to the hospital for the scans. I lay in the machine trying not to think about what they might find, and when I came out, Mom and Paul were waiting in the hallway. The results came back 6 hours later, and when the doctor called me into her office with Mom and Paul beside me, I was gripping their hands so hard my knuckles were white. The doctor smiled before she even sat down and told me the scans were clear. The symptoms were from a minor infection, nothing serious, easily treated with antibiotics. I felt the relief crash through me so hard I couldn't breathe, and then I was crying in Mom's arms like I was 6 years old again, and she was holding me and telling me I was okay. I was safe. She had me. 2 days after the health scare, a delivery person knocked on my apartment door with a massive flower arrangement. I signed for it confused because Mom and Paul had already left flowers on my kitchen counter. The card attached said it was from Dad, and the message read that he'd heard about my health scare and he was glad I was okay. I stood in my doorway holding these flowers and felt anger replace the relief I'd been feeling. Dad had no right to my medical information. He had no place in my health journey after disappearing the second I went into remission. The fact that he'd heard through family gossip and felt entitled to send flowers made me want to throw them off my balcony. Instead, I took a photo of the card and texted it to Grandma with a message asking if we could talk. She called me back within 5 minutes, and I could hear the guilt in her voice before she even apologized. She told me Dad had called her asking about me, saying he'd heard through the family that I'd had a health issue, and she'd confirmed it without thinking. She said she'd told him the scans came back clear and I was fine, and he'd asked for my address to send flowers. I took a deep breath and told Grandma as calmly as I could that she couldn't share information about my health with Dad anymore. I explained that his anxiety about my health didn't give him access to my private life, especially not after he'd proven he only cared when I was actively dying. Grandma was quiet for a long moment, then told me she understood and she was sorry. She said she'd told Dad because he'd asked, and she'd fallen back into old patterns of trying to keep everyone connected. But she saw now that protecting my boundaries mattered more than Dad's feelings. She promised she wouldn't share anything about me with him again unless I specifically gave her permission. I thanked her and hung up, then looked at the flowers sitting on my counter. They were beautiful and expensive and completely meaningless. I gave them to my neighbor and told her they were from someone I didn't want to think about. At my next therapy session, Evelyn told me she wanted to introduce me to a colleague of hers named Miranda Brooks. She explained that Miranda specialized in family reconciliation work, and before I could interrupt, Evelyn held up her hand and clarified. She wasn't suggesting I'd decided to reconcile with Dad. She wasn't pushing me toward forgiveness or contact. But if I ever chose limited contact in the future, Miranda could help me figure out what boundaries would look like and how to protect myself while exploring that possibility. Evelyn emphasized that reconciliation was completely optional and had to serve my healing, not Dad's guilt relief. I agreed to meet with Miranda because I trusted Evelyn, and 2 days later I sat in Miranda's office answering questions about my relationship with Dad. Miranda was in her 50s with kind eyes and a direct way of speaking that I appreciated. She told me that reconciliation didn't mean pretending the past didn't happen or accepting unacceptable behavior. It meant deciding whether limited, boundaried contact might serve my healing while protecting me from further harm. She said some people heal better with complete separation, and that was valid. Others heal better by controlling the terms of contact, and that was valid too. The important thing was figuring out what I needed, not what Dad wanted or what family expected. Miranda gave me homework, a list of questions to think about. What would limited contact with Dad actually look like? What boundaries would need to exist? What would make me feel safe? What behaviors from Dad would be deal breakers? She told me to take my time answering these questions, that there was no rush and no pressure to decide anything. 6 weeks after the party, I got a message through social media from Tanya asking if she could meet with me alone. My first instinct was to delete it without responding, but something made me screenshot it and send it to Evelyn instead. We spent an entire therapy session discussing whether meeting with Tanya would help or hurt my healing process. Evelyn asked me what I hoped to gain from the meeting and what I was afraid might happen. I told her I didn't hope to gain anything, but I was curious about what Tanya wanted to say after 20 years of treating me like an inconvenience. I was afraid she'd try to defend Dad or make excuses and I'd lose my temper again. Evelyn helped me establish ground rules. We'd meet in a public coffee shop. I'd drive myself so I could leave whenever I wanted. I'd tell Mom and Paul where I was going so someone knew. If Tanya started defending Dad's abandonment or making excuses, I'd end the conversation immediately. With those boundaries in place, I agreed to meet her. The coffee shop was downtown, neutral territory where neither of us had history. Tanya arrived before me and was already sitting at a corner table when I walked in. She looked smaller than I remembered, older too, with gray in her hair she hadn't bothered to cover. She stood up when she saw me, and we shook hands awkwardly instead of hugging. She thanked me for coming, and her voice was quiet, nothing like the sharp tone I remembered from phone calls and family gatherings. She ordered tea, and I ordered coffee, and we sat across from each other with the table between us like a barrier. Tanya started by telling me she'd been in therapy too since the party. She said hearing me confront Dad in front of everyone had forced her to look at things she'd been avoiding for 20 years, and facing those things had been brutal. Tanya wrapped her hands around her teacup and told me she was 23, and pregnant when she gave Dad the ultimatum. She said she'd been scared out of her mind that he'd leave her the way he'd left Mom, so she'd made him prove his commitment by cutting off his past completely. She explained that she'd told herself for years that I was fine with Mom, that I didn't need Dad, that his absence wasn't really hurting me because I had a whole other life he wasn't part of. She said hearing me at the party, hearing the actual damage his absence had caused, had destroyed that comfortable lie she'd been living in. She told me she'd spent 2 decades justifying what she'd demanded by painting me and Mom as bitter people who were better off without Dad's interference. But listening to me describe waiting by the window with my overnight bag, watching Dad play with the twins while I sat alone on the couch, had made her face the truth. She'd demanded a father erase his child because of her own insecurity, and that child had suffered real harm because of her fear. I looked at Tanya across the table and felt something shift inside me. She sat there waiting for my response, her hands still wrapped around that teacup like it was the only thing keeping her steady. I took a breath and said what I'd been thinking since she started talking. Understanding her fear didn't make me forgive her for demanding a father erase his child. Her insecurity cost me a parent while giving her children the father I deserved. The words came out quieter than I expected, but they landed hard. Tanya's eyes filled with tears and she nodded slowly. She told me she knew that. She wasn't asking for forgiveness, just trying to own the damage she caused. Her voice cracked on the word damage, and I saw her swallow hard. She set down her teacup and looked directly at me for the first time since we sat down. Then she said something that made my brain stutter. She'd told Dad she wouldn't stop him from having a relationship with me anymore, even if it made her uncomfortable, even if her jealousy flared up. She finally understood that her insecurity shouldn't control his relationship with his daughter. She said this didn't fix anything, but it removed the barrier she created. I stared at her, trying to process what she just said. For 22 years, this woman had been the wall between me and Dad, the reason he chose them over me, the ultimatum that erased me from his life. And now she was saying she'd taken that wall down. I didn't know what to do with that information. Tanya stood up and grabbed her purse. She thanked me for meeting her and said she hoped someday I might find some peace with everything that happened. Then she walked out of the coffee shop, and I sat there alone with my coffee and a head full of confusion. I left 10 minutes later and drove home in a daze. The whole conversation kept replaying in my mind. I'd expected to hate Tanya more after talking to her, expected her to defend herself or make excuses. Instead, I'd seen something different. A frightened young woman who made terrible choices out of fear and then spent 2 decades defending those choices instead of examining them. She'd built her whole marriage on the foundation of Dad cutting me out, built her security on my absence, and now she was looking at that foundation and seeing the cracks. Understanding her didn't equal forgiveness. I still hated what she'd done. Still hated that she'd demanded Dad choose and that he'd been weak enough to comply. But it complicated my anger. Made it harder to see her as just the villain in my story. She was a person who'd been scared and insecure and had made decisions that hurt a 6-year-old kid. Those decisions had consequences that rippled through 22 years. She was finally facing that. It didn't change the past, but it changed something about how I saw the whole situation. 7 weeks after the party, Grandma called me. She said Dad had asked her to pass along a request. He wanted to know if he could send me weekly letters with no expectation of response. No demands for replies. No pressure to read them if I didn't want to. Just letters. I told Grandma I needed to think about it and called Evelyn instead. We spent our next therapy session discussing whether Dad's letters would help or hurt my healing. Evelyn asked me what I was afraid might happen if I allowed the letters. I told her I was afraid he'd use them to guilt-trip me or manipulate me into forgiving him before I was ready. She asked what I hoped might happen. I didn't have an answer for that. We talked through different scenarios. What if the letters were genuine? What if they weren't? What if reading them triggered me? What if not reading them left me wondering? Evelyn helped me understand that I could set boundaries around the letters. I could allow them but establish rules. She suggested I decide what would make me feel safe. After an hour of discussion, I knew what I wanted. I called Grandma back and told her Dad could send letters, but with conditions. He could never ask to meet, never request replies, never guilt-trip or manipulate. If any letter violated those rules, the whole arrangement ended immediately. Grandma said she'd pass that along to him. The first letter arrived on a Saturday. I stared at the envelope for 20 minutes before opening it. My name and address in Dad's handwriting. No return address. I almost threw it away without reading it. But curiosity won. I opened it carefully like it might explode. The letter was 1 page, handwritten, dated 3 days earlier. It wasn't about his feelings or his guilt. Instead, he wrote about a memory of taking me to the zoo when I was 5. He described details I'd forgotten. How I'd insisted on seeing the penguins 3 times because I loved watching them swim. How I'd made him buy me a stuffed penguin from the gift shop and I'd named it Waddles. How I'd fallen asleep in the car on the way home clutching that penguin. The letter ended with one simple line. I'm glad I have this memory, and I hope you do too. No emotional manipulation, no requests, no apologies, just a memory. I sat on my couch holding that letter, and something in my chest felt strange. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just recognition that those good moments had existed before everything fell apart. Over the next month, Dad's weekly letters continued in the same style. Simple memories of our time together before he left. The time we built a blanket fort in the living room, the time I helped him wash his car and sprayed him with the hose, the time we made pancakes and I insisted on adding chocolate chips to mine. No guilt trips, no requests for forgiveness. Just memories written like he was preserving them. Evelyn pointed out in our session that Dad was finally giving me something without demanding anything in return. This was new behavior worth noting even if it didn't change the past. She said most people who hurt others want immediate forgiveness and reconciliation. They want their guilt eased quickly. Dad was doing something different. He was offering pieces of our shared history with no strings attached. Letting me have those memories without making them about his redemption. I didn't know what to do with that. Part of me wanted to stay angry. wanted to reject anything he offered because he'd lost the right to give me anything. But another part of me appreciated having those memories written down. Things I'd forgotten or pushed away. Moments when he'd actually been my dad before Tanya's ultimatum changed everything. 2 months after the party, I attended a cancer survivor support group that my oncologist had recommended. I'd been avoiding it because I didn't want to sit around talking about cancer with strangers. But Mom convinced me to try it once. The group met in a community center basement on Tuesday evenings. 12 people sitting in a circle on folding chairs. The facilitator asked if anyone wanted to share. A woman across from me talked about her sister who'd been super supportive during treatment, but disappeared once she went into remission. Said her sister only wanted to be there for the dramatic parts. Another person shared about their parent who'd shown up at the hospital with cameras wanting to document everything for social media. Someone else talked about friends who'd ghosted them during chemo because cancer made them uncomfortable. When it was my turn, I shared about Dad, how he'd abandoned me as a kid, how he'd returned during my cancer diagnosis and played devoted father for 3 months, how he'd disappeared again the second I went into remission. The room was quiet when I finished. Then the facilitator said something that hit me hard. She said my story fit a pattern of people who want credit for caring without doing the actual work of consistent love. People who show up for crisis moments because it makes them feel heroic, but can't handle the boring daily reality of actually being present. Other people in the group nodded. Several shared similar experiences. Family members who only appeared during the dramatic moments then vanished when regular life resumed. Hearing that my experience wasn't unique helped somehow. Made Dad's behavior feel less personal and more like a pattern that existed beyond just us. 2 months after the party, Isabella messaged me on social media again. She said she'd been thinking about our coffee conversation and she wanted to ask me something. She asked if we could build a relationship separate from Dad and our complicated family history. She said she wanted to know her sister. The message sat in my inbox for 3 days before I responded. I kept thinking about what it would mean to have a relationship with Isabella. She was Dad's daughter with Tanya, the child from the family that replaced me. But she was also my half-sister who hadn't chosen any of this. She'd been born into a situation where her existence meant my erasure, and that wasn't her fault. I finally wrote back and said yes. I wanted that too, even though the circumstances that made us strangers weren't our fault. We needed to figure out how to be siblings despite everything. Isabella and I started meeting regularly for coffee. Once a week at first, then more often as we got comfortable. We talked about surface things initially. Her job in marketing, my work in graphic design, shows we were watching, books we'd read, carefully avoiding the big stuff. But gradually we went deeper. She told me about growing up with Dad and Tanya, how their house always felt tense, how Tanya controlled everything Dad did, how she'd always known I existed, but Tanya had made it clear I was a forbidden topic. She said she'd seen photos of me at Grandma's house and wondered about her older sister who lived somewhere else. I told her about my childhood with Mom and Paul, about waiting by the window for a dad who stopped showing up, about building a life where Dad's absence became normal. We were carefully building something that belonged to us, rather than being defined by Dad's failures. Inside jokes started forming. Shared interests emerged. She made me laugh, talking about her disaster dates. I told her about my terrible boss who micromanaged everything. We became friends despite the weirdness of our situation. Sisters who were strangers becoming sisters who actually knew each other. 3 months after the party, Camden reached out. Isabella's twin brother. His message was longer than hers had been. He apologized for taking so long to contact me. Said watching Isabella develop a relationship with me made him realize he'd been avoiding me. He admitted that acknowledging my existence meant confronting uncomfortable truths about Dad. About the father he'd thought he knew versus the father who'd abandoned his first daughter. He said he'd spent 3 months processing what I'd said at Grandma's party. Processing that his whole childhood had been built on my erasure. That his perfect family had required making me disappear. He said he was ready to face that now if I was willing to talk to him. I showed the message to Isabella at our next coffee meeting. She said Camden had been struggling since the party, that he'd always worshipped Dad, and hearing the truth about what Dad had done to me shattered something for him. She said he needed time to reconcile the father he knew with the father who'd failed me so completely. I wrote back to Camden and said we could meet. I met Camden at the same coffee shop where Isabella and I had our first real conversation. He walked in looking uncomfortable, shoulders tight like he expected this to go badly. He sat down across from me and spent the first minute just staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red around the edges like he hadn't been sleeping well. He told me he'd been avoiding this meeting for weeks because talking to me meant admitting things about Dad he'd spent his whole life ignoring. I asked him what things exactly. He said watching Dad with him and Isabella always felt weird, like Dad was performing instead of just being their father. Every hug looked rehearsed. Every conversation seemed calculated. He said he thought that was just how fathers acted until he saw his friends with their dads and realized something was off. My story at Grandma's party finally explained why Dad's fatherhood felt fake. He was trying to prove something instead of just being present. Camden said he'd been thinking about all the times Dad checked with Tanya before making decisions about him and Isabella, like he needed permission to parent his own kids. He asked me what Dad was like before he left Mom. I told him I barely remembered because I was only 6, but the few memories I had showed a different person. Someone relaxed. Someone who didn't seem afraid. Camden nodded slowly and said that made sense because Dad with Tanya always seemed scared of doing the wrong thing. We talked for 2 hours about our completely different experiences with the same father. He had the present version who showed up but felt hollow. I had the absent version who proved his love wasn't strong enough to overcome inconvenience. By the end, neither of us knew if we were angry at Dad or sad for him. 2 weeks later, Grandma invited me to dinner at her house with just Mom, Paul, and her. The table felt too big with only 4 of us when it usually held the entire extended family. Grandma made pot roast because it was Mom's favorite, and I realized she'd never made Mom's favorite before when Dad and his family were there. We ate quietly for a while before Grandma set down her fork and looked directly at Mom. She said she needed to apologize for something she should have said 20 years ago. She told Mom she was sorry for not speaking up more when Dad abandoned me. She said she watched her son fail his daughter, and she made excuses for him because he was her child, and she wanted to believe he'd eventually do better. But staying silent made Mom carry that burden alone, and that wasn't fair. Mom reached across the table and squeezed Grandma's hand. She said she understood the position Grandma was in, caught between her son and her granddaughter. She said she never blamed Grandma for Dad's choices. But I could see Mom's eyes getting wet, and I knew the validation mattered even if she said it didn't. Grandma turned to me next and said she was proud of what I did at her birthday party, even though it was hard to watch. She said sometimes the truth needs to be spoken out loud no matter how uncomfortable it makes everyone. Paul cleared his throat and said this was the most honest conversation this family had probably ever had. We all laughed a little and the tension broke. The rest of dinner felt lighter, like we'd all been holding our breath for years, and finally let it out. 3.5 months after the party, Dad's weekly letter arrived with different handwriting than usual. His normal, careful script looked shakier, more rushed. He wrote that he'd started attending a support group for absent parents trying to make amends. The first meeting nearly destroyed him because hearing other people's stories made him see his own pattern clearly for the first time. He'd shown up for my birth, then disappeared into work. Showed up for my first day of school, then missed every parent-teacher conference after. Showed up when I got cancer, then vanished when I went into remission. He said one woman in the group called it crisis-dependent presence, and the phrase hit him like a punch. He was only there for the dramatic moments because those were the times when his absence would make him look bad. The daily reality of being a father, the boring appointments and homework help and just sitting together watching TV, that's what he'd always run from. He wrote that he was starting to understand the difference between loving someone and actually showing up for them. The letter was 4 pages long and he didn't ask for anything. He just laid out his realization like he needed me to know he finally got it. I carried that letter around for a week before I decided to respond. I'd let Dad send his weekly letters for months without ever writing back because responding felt like opening a door I wasn't sure I wanted to open. But something about this letter felt different. He wasn't making excuses or asking for forgiveness. He was just being honest about his failures. I sat down at my kitchen table with a blank piece of paper and wrote 3 sentences. I told him his letters had been acceptable because they gave without demanding. I told him if he wanted any chance at limited contact in the future, he needed to demonstrate consistent change over at least a year, not just 3 months of guilt-driven effort. I told him I was watching to see if this self-awareness lasted, or if it was just another crisis-dependent moment. I mailed it before I could change my mind. Dad's response came faster than his usual weekly schedule. He must have written back the same day he got my letter. He thanked me for responding and said he understood my timeline without trying to negotiate. He wrote that his therapist told him real change takes years to prove, not months. He said earning back even a small place in my life would require showing through sustained action that he was different from the person who abandoned me. He promised he wouldn't push for more than I was willing to give, and he'd respect whatever boundaries I set. The letter ended with him saying he was grateful I was willing to watch his progress, even if it never led to reconciliation. Reading it made my chest feel tight because part of me wanted to believe him, and part of me remembered every other time he'd made promises. 4 months after the party, I had my regular oncology appointment. Mom and Paul picked me up because these appointments still made me nervous, even though I'd been in remission for over a year. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and old magazines. A kid across from us was sleeping in his mother's lap, bald head shiny under the fluorescent lights. I remembered being that kid. The nurse called my name and we followed her back to the exam room where my oncologist was already pulling up my latest scans on the computer. She smiled before she even spoke, and I felt the tension leave my shoulders. She said the scans looked perfect, no signs of recurrence, prognosis excellent. I was still in full remission. Sitting there between Mom and Paul while the doctor explained my continued monitoring schedule, I realized this was what family actually looked like. People who showed up for the boring appointments, not just the dramatic diagnosis. People who took time off work to sit in waiting rooms and hear good news they already expected. Dad had been at the appointment when I got my remission news the first time, crying with relief and making promises. But he wasn't here now for the follow-up that confirmed I was staying healthy. That absence told me everything. My next therapy session with Evelyn happened 2 days after the oncology appointment. I told her about Dad's letters and my decision to respond. I told her about the support group he joined and his acknowledgement of his crisis-dependent pattern. She listened without interrupting until I finished. Then she said something that made my throat tight. She said I was mourning the father I deserved rather than the father I had, and that grief was valid even though Dad was alive. She said I could acknowledge his current efforts while still protecting myself from future disappointment, and those two things didn't contradict each other. I started crying in her office, ugly crying that made my nose run and my face blotchy. She handed me tissues and let me sob until I could breathe again. When I finally calmed down, she asked me what I needed from Dad to feel safe trying limited contact eventually. I said consistency over time. I said showing up for regular life, not just emergencies. I said respecting my boundaries without guilt trips. She wrote it all down and told me those were reasonable requirements for someone who'd failed me as badly as Dad had. 3 days later, Roderick called and invited me to dinner at his house with Lucas and Tabitha. I hadn't seen Roderick since Grandma's birthday party where he'd witnessed my public confrontation with Dad. Walking into their house felt strange because this was Dad's brother, and I didn't know whose side he was on. But Roderick hugged me at the door, and Tabitha immediately put me to work chopping vegetables like I was family who belonged there. Lucas set the table and kept making jokes that had his parents rolling their eyes. During dinner, Roderick put down his fork and looked at me seriously. He said he was proud of how I'd handled everything with Dad. He said watching me set boundaries while remaining open to the possibility of future connection showed more maturity than most of the adults in the family had demonstrated. Tabitha added that what I did at the party was brave even though it was hard to watch. Lucas said he'd always known Uncle Dad was messing up with me, but nobody ever talked about it until I forced everyone to face it. The validation from Dad's own brother made something in my chest loosen. I wasn't crazy for being angry. I wasn't cruel for setting boundaries. I was just protecting myself from someone who'd already hurt me badly. 5 months after the party, a cousin I barely knew sent me a wedding invitation. The ceremony would be at a church across town with a reception at a hotel ballroom. Dad would definitely be there with Tanya and the twins. The thought of seeing him at a family event made my stomach hurt. I brought the invitation to my next therapy session, and Evelyn helped me work through how to handle it. We spent the entire hour establishing clear boundaries. Polite acknowledgement if Dad approached me, but no private conversations. I could leave any time I felt uncomfortable without guilt or explanation. I'd tell Mom and Paul my boundaries so they could support me. Evelyn made me practice saying no to Dad if he asked to talk privately. We role-played different scenarios until I felt steady. She reminded me that attending the wedding didn't mean I owed Dad anything. I could be in the same room with him without having a relationship with him. The wedding day arrived too fast. I wore a blue dress Mom said made me look strong and pretty at the same time. Paul drove because I was too nervous to focus on traffic. The church was already packed when we arrived. I spotted Dad immediately because he was standing near the entrance with Tanya and the twins. My heart started racing, but I made myself walk past them calmly. Dad looked up and our eyes met. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement that didn't demand anything. I nodded back and kept walking. Mom squeezed my hand. We found seats near the middle, and I tried to focus on the ceremony instead of the fact that Dad was somewhere behind us. During the reception, I stayed close to Mom and Paul, dancing with cousins I actually liked, and avoiding the side of the room where Dad's family congregated. I watched him from across the ballroom and saw what Isabella had mentioned. His fatherhood did seem performative. He kept checking Tanya's face before interacting with the twins, like he needed her approval. When Camden wanted to leave early, Dad looked at Tanya first before agreeing. When Isabella asked him to dance, he glanced at Tanya before saying yes. Every movement seemed calculated to keep Tanya happy rather than just responding naturally to his kids. I felt sad watching it. Sad for all of us trapped in the dynamic she'd created 22 years ago when she demanded he choose. That evening, Tanya found me standing near the dessert table trying to decide between chocolate cake and lemon tart. She approached carefully like I might bolt if she moved too fast. She touched my arm gently and thanked me for meeting with her all those months ago at the coffee shop. Her voice was quiet enough that nobody nearby could hear. She said confronting her role in Dad's abandonment of me had been the hardest therapy work she'd ever done. She was trying to be less controlling of Dad's relationships, though it was difficult after 20 years of that pattern. I nodded because I didn't know what else to do. She squeezed my arm once and walked away before I could respond. The interaction left me feeling strange and unbalanced. Paul found me a few minutes later and asked if I wanted to dance. We moved to the dance floor and swayed to some slow song I didn't recognize. I told him he'd been more of a father to me than Dad ever was. I said showing up for soccer games and homework help and all the boring daily moments built real relationships. Paul's eyes got wet and he pulled me into a tighter hug. He said being present for me had been one of his life's greatest privileges. I pressed my face against his shoulder and felt grateful for the parent I'd actually had, instead of mourning the one who'd failed me. 6 months after the party, Dad's letters continued arriving every single week without missing once. The content had changed from simple memories to something heavier and more honest. He acknowledged specific ways he'd failed me. Missing my high school graduation, not helping with college applications or tuition, disappearing completely after my remission like my cancer had been an inconvenient interruption to his real life. He wrote about how he'd convinced himself I was better off without him, when really he was just taking the easier path. He said Tanya's ultimatum had worked because he'd wanted an excuse to choose the simpler option. The letters never asked for anything, never pushed for contact or forgiveness, just laid out his failures in clear language without hiding behind vague apologies. I kept every letter in a box under my bed even though I wasn't sure why. I scheduled a session with Miranda to discuss what limited contact with Dad might actually look like if I decided to allow it. We sat in her office with afternoon sun coming through the blinds and mapped out boundaries. Any contact would need to be structured with clear rules. Infrequent meetings on a schedule I controlled completely. Always on my terms with the understanding I could revoke access anytime he reverted to old patterns or prioritized Tanya's comfort over my boundaries. Miranda helped me write out specific guidelines. Monthly coffee meetings maximum. No discussions about Tanya or the twins unless I brought them up first. No guilt trips about how hard this was for him. No expectations of forgiveness or reconciliation. Just supervised conversations where we could assess whether he'd actually changed or if this was another performance. I left her office with a folder full of boundary documents, feeling more in control than I had in months. Isabella called me the next week and asked to meet for lunch. We sat at a small cafe near her campus, and she told me she'd confronted Dad about his fake parenting style. She'd demanded he be more genuine with her instead of constantly performing for Tanya's approval. She said my story at Grandma's party had given her permission to expect more from him. She was noticing small changes in how he related to her now. More honest conversations, less concern about appearing perfect. He'd admitted to her that he'd been afraid of Tanya's anger for so long he'd forgotten how to just be himself with his kids. Isabella said it was weird and uncomfortable, but also felt more real than anything they'd shared before. I felt proud of her for demanding better, even though it meant confronting hard truths about the father she'd thought she knew. 7 months after the party, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote Dad a letter. I proposed we meet for coffee with Miranda present as a mediator. I outlined clear expectations in numbered points. This didn't mean reconciliation or forgiveness, just a conversation where he could demonstrate his understanding of the harm he'd caused. I would assess whether limited contact might eventually be possible based on how he handled himself. I sealed the envelope and mailed it before I could change my mind. His response came 3 days later. He agreed to every condition without argument. He thanked me for considering it and said he understood this was more than he deserved. The mediated conversation happened in Miranda's office on a Tuesday morning. Dad showed up 15 minutes early looking nervous and tired. He'd brought a notebook with pages of handwritten notes. Miranda explained the ground rules and Dad nodded along without interrupting. I started talking and detailed every specific way his abandonment had damaged me. Sitting by the window with my overnight bag waiting for him to pick me up. Watching him play with the twins at family gatherings while I sat alone on the couch. Graduating high school without him in the audience. Fighting cancer without him until I was dying enough to make him look bad. Believing he'd changed during those 3 months only to have him disappear the second I went into remission. Dad listened to everything without making excuses. He acknowledged each point with specific language that showed he actually understood. He didn't center his own pain or try to explain away his choices. He just sat there and absorbed the weight of what he'd done to me. When I finished, Dad was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he understood if I never wanted a relationship with him. He was doing this therapy work and self-examination for himself, regardless of the outcome, because he needed to become someone who didn't abandon people he loved when it got difficult. He said the pattern had started with his own father leaving, and he'd spent decades repeating the same damage. He wasn't asking for forgiveness or a second chance, just trying to break the cycle so he didn't keep hurting people. His lack of pressure or demands made something in my chest loosen slightly. I told him I'd think about what came next. 8 months after the party, I agreed to occasional supervised coffee meetings with Dad. We'd meet once a month at a cafe near Miranda's office with clear time limits. Brief, structured conversations where I could evaluate whether he maintained consistent change. The first meeting was awkward as hell. We sat across from each other with our drinks, and neither of us knew what to say. Dad asked about my job, and I gave short answers. I asked about his therapy, and he shared some insights his counselor had given him. We talked for exactly 30 minutes, then I left. He didn't try to hug me or push for more time. Just thanked me for coming and said he'd see me next month if I was willing. I drove home feeling exhausted, but not angry. My relationship with Isabella and Camden kept growing independent of anything happening with Dad. We started meeting for dinner every few weeks, just the three of us. We created our own inside jokes about terrible movies and shared recipes and texted each other random thoughts throughout the day. They became genuine parts of my life as siblings rather than as Dad's other children. Camden told me about his struggling music career, and I helped him edit his grant applications. Isabella brought me coffee when I was stressed about work deadlines. We built something that belonged to us instead of being defined by Dad's failures. I was grateful the confrontation at Grandma's party had opened the door to knowing them, even though the path to get here had been brutal. 9 months after Grandma's birthday party, Dad kept showing up in small, steady ways that didn't demand anything from me. His letters arrived every Wednesday morning like clockwork, never asking for responses or pushing past the boundaries I'd drawn. The monthly coffee meetings happened on schedule at the same cafe near Miranda's office, 30 minutes each time, and he never tried to extend them or guilt me about keeping things structured. I'd show up expecting him to slip back into old patterns, waiting for the moment when he'd prioritize Tanya's comfort over my boundaries, or disappear because maintaining consistent effort got too hard. But he just kept coming, kept writing, kept respecting every limit I set without complaint or manipulation. During one of my sessions with Evelyn, I mentioned how weird it felt that Dad had maintained this routine for 9 months straight without faltering. She leaned forward in her chair and pointed out something I hadn't fully processed yet. This consistency over 9 months meant more than those 3 months of crisis-driven presence during my cancer treatment. Back then, he'd shown up because my potential death made him look bad, and eased his guilt. Now he was showing up when I was healthy and didn't need him, when there was no emergency to make him feel important, when Tanya probably complained about the time he spent writing letters to me. He was doing the boring, unglamorous work of being present without getting anything back except the possibility that someday I might let him be a small part of my life. Evelyn said that kind of sustained effort over time, especially when it wasn't rewarded or acknowledged, demonstrated real change rather than performative guilt relief. I sat with that observation for days afterward, turning it over in my mind during my commute to work, and while I made dinner in my apartment. Dad was proving something I never thought he could, showing up consistently when it was difficult and unrewarding, and I didn't know what to do with that information. My next routine oncology appointment arrived in early October, and I scheduled it for a Thursday afternoon so I wouldn't have to take a full day off work. The night before, I found Dad's latest letter on my kitchen counter where I'd left it after reading it that morning. He'd written about a memory of teaching me to ride a bike when I was 4, describing how I'd insisted on trying without training wheels even though I kept falling. The letter ended like all the others, with no requests or emotional manipulation, just a simple acknowledgement that he was glad he had these memories, even though he'd thrown away the chance to make more. At the bottom, he'd added a single line asking if I'd be willing to let him know how my appointment went. Not asking to attend or be involved in my medical care, just wondering if I was okay. I stared at those words for a long time, feeling the old anger rise up mixed with something newer and more complicated. He had no right to my medical information after disappearing once I went into remission. But the question felt different from his behavior during my cancer treatment. Back then, he'd inserted himself into every appointment because it made him feel like a devoted father. Now he was asking permission to know basic information, respecting that my health was private while acknowledging his concern. I brought the letter to my session with Evelyn the next morning before my appointment. We talked through what it would mean to allow him access to my medical information versus giving him basic updates through a third party. Evelyn helped me see that I could acknowledge his concern without giving him direct access to my private health details. After talking it through for most of the session, I decided I'd allow Grandma to tell him basic information after my appointments. Just whether I was still in remission, nothing detailed or specific. That way he could know I was okay without me having to manage his anxiety or let him back into my medical life. The appointment itself went smoothly, and my oncologist confirmed I was still in full remission with excellent markers. When I called Grandma that evening, I told her she could let Dad know I was still healthy if he asked, but nothing more than that. She understood immediately and thanked me for finding a middle ground. Hanging up the phone, I felt okay about the decision instead of resentful, which surprised me. 10 months after the party, I woke up one Saturday morning and realized I'd slept through the entire night without the nightmare that had haunted me for years. The one where I was 6 years old sitting by the window with my overnight bag, watching cars drive past while Dad never came. I'd been having that dream at least twice a week since my cancer diagnosis, waking up with my chest tight and my hands shaking. But lately the nightmares had become less frequent, and now I couldn't remember the last time I'd had one. I made coffee and sat on my couch looking out at the morning light, noticing how different my body felt. The constant anger that had lived in my chest for as long as I could remember had transformed into something quieter and less sharp. Not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness felt like letting Dad off the hook for 22 years of abandonment, but something closer to acceptance. I could look at Dad now and see him clearly as a deeply flawed person who had failed me in catastrophic ways, and was genuinely trying to change, even though that change came 2 decades too late to give me the father I deserved as a child. The acceptance didn't erase what he'd done or make his abandonment okay. It just meant I could hold the truth of his failures and his current efforts in my mind at the same time without the rage consuming me. I could acknowledge that he was doing the work now, while also knowing it would never compensate for all those years of sitting by the window waiting for him. Mom called that afternoon to check in, and I told her about sleeping better and feeling different. She was quiet for a moment before saying she'd noticed I seemed lighter lately, less weighed down by old pain. We talked about how speaking my truth at Grandma's party had been brutal but necessary, how carrying silent pain for years had been slowly destroying me from the inside. Getting it all out, even in that explosive and public way, had started something shifting in me. The healing wasn't about Dad or whether he changed. It was about me finally refusing to carry the weight of his choices anymore. I pulled out my journal that evening and started writing about the past 10 months, trying to make sense of everything that had happened since Grandma's birthday party. The words poured out across pages as I detailed the immediate aftermath, the family pressure to reconcile, the therapy sessions with Evelyn, the mediated conversation with Dad, the growing relationships with Isabella and Camden, the coffee meetings and letters that had become routine. Writing it all down, I could see the pattern clearly. Speaking my truth at that party had been the beginning of my real healing, not because it fixed anything with Dad, but because it freed me from carrying silent pain that had been poisoning me for 22 years. I'd spent so long protecting everyone else's comfort by not talking about Dad's abandonment, letting family gatherings happen without addressing the massive absence in the room, pretending I was fine when I was actually dying inside from being erased. The confrontation had shattered all that false peace and forced everyone to face what Dad had done. It gave Isabella and Camden permission to question their perfect family image. It made Tanya confront her role in demanding Dad erase his first child. It pushed Dad to finally do the sustained work of change instead of just showing up during crises. And most importantly, it freed me from the prison of silence and pretending. As I wrote, I realized something else that felt important. Dad might earn a small, carefully limited place in my life eventually if he continued this consistent change over years, not months. But that would always be a minor, boundaried role. Mom and Paul remained my real family, the people who had shown up consistently when it mattered, who had been there for soccer games and homework help and cancer treatment and every boring Tuesday in between. They were the ones who taught me what real love looked like through their actions rather than their words. I was finally at peace knowing that I had deserved better than what Dad gave me as a child, and I'd built something better without him. The family I chose and the life I created were mine, and Dad's absence from most of it was his loss, not mine.